Growing up, I had a fascination with horror stories. Whenever I found myself in a gathering, whether it was with friends, neighbors, or family, the conversation would inevitably turn to spine-chilling tales of the supernatural. It was during one such gathering that I heard a story from Aunt Martha, a tale so vivid and horrifying that it still sends shivers down my spine. Aunt Martha, now a robust woman in her 60s, swears by the truth of this story, claiming it as an experience she will never forget. It happened during her childhood, back in the 1960s, when she lived with her parents in a small countryside village. Their home, like many in the area, was a modest wooden house elevated on stilts, surrounded by dense forests and miles away from the nearest town. Her parents, farmers by trade, often spent nights away tending to their crops deep in the woods. It wasn't uncommon in their community for children as young as 10 to be left alone at home, expected to manage cooking, cleaning, and other household chores. Aunt Martha, at the tender age of 11, was no exception. One particularly cold and rainy night, her parents had left for the fields as usual. Aunt Martha, accustomed to solitude, spent the evening reading by a dim oil lamp before finally retreating to her small bedroom to sleep. The gentle patter of rain against the roof and the faint rustling of leaves outside created a tranquil symphony that lulled her into a deep slumber. But sometime past midnight, she awoke abruptly, her stomach churning with the uncomfortable need to use the bathroom. The bathroom, in this case, was a small platform at the back of the house, partially exposed to the elements, known as the back deck. It was accessed through the kitchen and overlooked the dark forest beyond. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, Aunt Martha stepped cautiously out of her room. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. She made her way through the kitchen, her oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. As she approached the back deck, she heard it. A faint splish-splash sound, as if someone, or something, was stepping through water. She froze in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. Her immediate thought was of a stray animal, perhaps a raccoon or a fox, rummaging around for food. Summoning her courage, she tiptoed closer to the deck, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. The sound of splashing grew louder, and then abruptly stopped. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain. And then came the scratching. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like claws dragging across the wooden walls of the house. Aunt Martha's breath hitched as she realized the noise was coming from just outside the kitchen, near one of the small ventilation holes in the wooden walls. These holes, carved to allow airflow, were positioned high enough that only someone tall or something unnatural could reach them. Curiosity mingled with fear as she edged closer to the hole. Perhaps it was just an owl or another bird seeking shelter from the rain, she thought, trying to rationalize the situation. Holding her breath, she leaned down to peer through the small opening. What she saw made her blood run cold. On the other side of the hole was an eye, but it wasn't human. The sclera was a sickly yellow and the iris burned a fiery red. The pupil, narrow and reptilian, seemed to dilate as it locked onto hers. For a brief, horrifying moment, Aunt Martha felt as though the creature was staring straight into her soul. She let out a scream and stumbled backward, the lamp slipping from her grasp and shattering on the floor. Darkness engulfed her as she scrambled to her feet, her only thought being to get back to her room. But as she turned to flee, the scratching sound moved. Now it came from the floor beneath her feet. The house, elevated on wooden stilts, had a crawl space underneath that was typically used for storage. Whatever was outside had made its way underneath the house, its claws raking against the wooden planks directly below her. Aunt Martha could hear it moving, pacing back and forth, as though it was searching for a way inside. Terrified beyond reason, she bolted to her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She dove under her thin blanket, clutching it tightly as though it could shield her from the horrors outside. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, moving from the floor to the walls and then to her bedroom window. Though she couldn't bring herself to look, she heard the unmistakable sound of long nails tapping against the glass, slow and deliberate. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake, muttering prayers under her breath and willing the dawn to come. The tapping eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse, leaving her to wonder if the creature had truly left or if it was simply waiting for her to emerge. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced through the gaps in her window, Aunt Martha mustered the courage to leave her room. The house was eerily quiet, but nothing appeared out of place. She cautiously stepped onto the back deck, her eyes scanning the forest for any signs of the intruder. What she found instead sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Scratched into the wooden planks of the deck were strange, unrecognizable symbols, as though carved by claws. The marks were deep and deliberate, forming patterns that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. And just beyond the deck, in the muddy ground, were footprints, huge clawed footprints that led from the house into the dense forest. When her parents returned later that day, Aunt Martha recounted the events in a trembling voice. Though her father dismissed it as a bad dream, her mother's face grew pale. She hurriedly called for the village elder, a wizened man who was well versed in local folklore and legends. After examining the symbols and the footprints, the elder's expression grew grave. He warned Aunt Martha's parents that their family had likely been visited by a watcher, an ancient spirit known to haunt those who lived too close to the forest. These entities, he explained, were neither fully of this world nor the next, and once they took an interest in someone, they rarely let go. Following his advice, Aunt Martha's family performed a cleansing ritual, offering food and prayers to appease the spirit. They also reinforced the walls and floors of the house, sealing any gaps that could serve as entry points. Though the creature never returned, Aunt Martha said she could never shake the feeling of being watched, especially on rainy nights. Even now, decades later, she avoids looking out of windows after dark, haunted by the memory of those burning red eyes staring back at her. It's a story she rarely shares, but when she does, the fear in her voice is palpable. And as for me, every time I hear the sound of rain at night, I can't help but think of Aunt Martha's tale and wonder what might be lurking just beyond the darkness.